Good morning everyone and welcome to ARB Group's webinar this afternoon. Today we'll be covering skid resistance investigatory levels, appropriate and dynamic. Our presenter today is Paul Hillier of ARB Group and my name is Angela Juhas. I'll be your moderator for today. I do apologise, I'm a little bit under the weather so my voice is a little bit off, but luckily for me Paul is in very good form and I'm sure he will compensate. Before we get started with the presentation, I'll just quickly move through a few housekeeping items for everyone to be aware of. So we're aiming for about 40 to 45 minutes for today's presentation and about 20 minutes for questions. Now please don't leave your questions until the end because webinars are more enjoyable if they're interactive. So send them through as they pop into your head and we'll address them during the course of the presentation. We are also recording today's session, ladies and gentlemen, so please there's no need to take notes or anything like that. We'll send out a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the presentation material once the webinar has concluded. Now, as I said, if anyone wants to ask a question of Paul, please do type it into your question box right there in your control panel. And the little raise your hand icon, draw that to your attention in case you do want us to address any questions of yours or if Paul asks you to put your hand up for another reason. All right, now before we start the presentation, once again I'd like to welcome Paul Hillier for joining us today. Paul's based in our Sydney office and it's a great privilege to work with him again. Hello Paul, tell us what's news in the world of skid resistance.
Oh, I don't know. Good morning Angela, good morning everybody. I don't know what's news in skid resistance, but it's a lovely sunny morning here in Sydney and we're all very buoyant by the victory of a certain blue team in the State of Origin last night, so we're very happy here this morning.
Oh, I'm sure you are. Good for you. And I understand we're starting today's presentation with a bit of a poll question for our audience.
Indeed. If the measured skid resistance of a 100-metre section of road is below the person's investigatory level, I have to effect a physical remedial treatment to the surface. Is that true or is that false? And if you could type your response into the question box, and Angela will do a quick summary for me. So, yeah, if the measured value is below investigatory, do I have to effect a physical remedial treatment to the surface? What do you think?
Well, we've got a few responses so far. Some people are still a little bit shy. We've got an interesting little a mix there. We do have about half saying false, half saying true. So what does that sort of say to you, Paul?
Okay, well, I guess the question hangs on a couple of words that we've got there. Have to effect a physical treatment, as in must effect a physical treatment? Well, maybe not. And then also investigatory levels. So that will be proving to me that we will prompt some form of investigation prior to effecting a remedial treatment rather than doing it straight away. So I guess there's a little bit of devil in the detail of the question, and we'll recap on some of that as we go along. But it was just to get the old grey matter moving before we start up on the main bit of today's webinar. We're going to be looking at the development, use and review of skid resistance investigatory levels. They really are an essential and a key component of our local skid resistance strategy that we have, our management strategy. It's quite a specific topic, it's quite a niche area, but hopefully you'll find that there are reasons for us trying to put on the webinar today that it's a standalone topic which people can get some value from. It is one of the key building blocks in the Aus ILs Guide 2005 in establishing a local strategy as well. It's pinpointed as being one of the key things that we need to think about. But first, perhaps a quick recap. There may be a few people that haven't done the previous webinar series on skid resistance, which covered a wide range of things. What's this thing called skid resistance that we're talking about? Well, basically it's a manufactured term that we've established, and it's the contribution of the road surface alone to the level of grip between a vehicle tyre and the road surface. So picking out those key words, the grip, and if the demand for a manoeuvre from a particular vehicle is greater than the level of grip that we're providing by the road surface, then we can get a loss of control. Unfortunately, if we get a loss of control, it can lead then on to crashes. So just recapping, the skid resistance is something that we're providing as road engineers to assist with the overall safety of the road network or the road system, as we increasingly call it these days. So you might be thinking, well, this is pretty easy. Why don't we just provide a uniformly high level of skid resistance everywhere, so that we provide a skid resistance that goes for all sorts of demands? Well, yeah, it sounds like a logical thing, but unfortunately there's a couple of problems to that. The first one is that we won't have the money to do it. And the second thing is we need the materials. Even if we were to try to do it and mysteriously got hold of a large sum of money, we wouldn't necessarily have the materials of a high enough quality to provide the highest levels of skid resistance across kilometres and kilometres of our road network. And if we did that, we really would be setting the bar way too high for us. We'd be wasting resources, because we'll see in a moment, a number of sites don't need those high levels of skid resistance. We'd be setting the bar way too high, we'd have resource issues, and possibly even some potential liability or legal issues as a result of not implementing our strategy or policy in practice, or our documented policy and not following it through. Okay, just want to check at this stage that everyone's travelling okay. That was just a little bit of introduction and a reminder of what skid resistance is before we go on to our investigated levels and how we form them. Are people okay?
I think we're okay. We've had a few yeps and yeses from our audience, so it looks like they're just about travelling along nicely. So thank you, Andrew, Laszlo, Jose, all of you who got your answers through. I think we're okay, Paul.
Okay, whereabouts do we have people from? That might be a nice thing to find out, where our audience is based. Perhaps a few people?
Absolutely. Look, we'll leave that open and we'll see what responses come through. So, cold Hobart. Thank you, Jose. I bet it is pretty chilly down there now. We've got John from Perth, Adalia from New Zealand. We have Andrew from Toowoomba, Wasantha from Adelaide. So we've got a pretty good little cross-section there. We're covering Australia and New Zealand fairly nicely.
Okay, and I think a particularly big effort from our Perth people. We're sort of 11 o'clock here, so nice and early there in Perth, but I'm sure people are with us there, so that's great. So let's move on to what we think the answer is. Well, how do we go about this? How do we achieve this appropriate level of skid resistance that we're talking about? Well, as with all things, or a number of things we do in the road sphere, we adopt what we call a risk management approach, or more accurately in terms of this, the equalisation of crash risk approach. That's just a very posh way of saying we're going to provide an appropriate level of skid resistance at all locations on the network. And as we touched upon already, we really need to think about providing our highest levels of skid resistance where they're most needed. Things like our approaches to traffic signals, railway crossings, curves, those sorts of things where the demand for grip is greatest. And what we do is we actually establish a crash risk profile, a local crash risk profile, that we understand and that we're prepared to carry as a road agency. And that's a particularly important point, and that's why I've highlighted it there. That's what we're doing. We're establishing a risk profile that we're prepared to accept. We're not going to stop every single wet skidding related crash on the network, but we're certainly trying to reduce as many as we possibly can and reduce the severity of some of our crashes. Once we've done that, we can take our regular measurements and we can assess the value that we've recorded against the appropriate level for each individual site. Now, you probably thought you've used the word appropriate 2 or 3 times within the last slide. So how do we work out what's appropriate? Well, the way we can do it is working from first principles. We can have a look at our network and we can identify the skidding related crashes that we have out there. We need to understand where they've occurred, what type of roads. We need to have a think about the geometry and the alignment. Are there any patterns or trends in the skidding crashes that we're getting? What sort of traffic volumes are involved? What sort of speeds and what sort of manoeuvres were being attempted by the motorists involved or road users involved? And levels of demand and stress across the network. One of the things we might also do is perhaps we might also do a pre-survey. We might just send the measuring device around to measure the skid resistance of the whole network just to give us an initial benchmark. Some people have done that to try and establish what's appropriate for their network when viewing also this crash information that we were able to gather together. Again, that sounds pretty logical and straightforward, but we need to remember that this will be quite a complex task to achieve. We know that we get relatively small numbers of skidding-related crashes, and that makes a robust analysis quite difficult sometimes. Also in a crash we have lots of factors typically, and establishing if the road surface was a causation factor or a contributing factor is also sometimes quite difficult. And the bottom line is that it's very hard for us to determine safe or unsafe in terms of skid resistance. Just because the skid resistance is falling at a location doesn't mean that numerous cars are going to start flying off the road surface in ever-increasing numbers and we can stand there second after second and watch them do it. And the bottom line is therefore that we don't think in terms of intervention levels when we're talking about skid resistance. We talk about investigatory levels, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So we're doing our crash study. What might this look like if we were to put it onto some sort of graph or axis? Well, as you can see here, we have a graph. We have on the y-axis the number of skidding crashes per 100 million vehicle kilometres travelled. Along the bottom, we have a measure of the skid resistance. In this particular case, it's a mean summer scrim value. And what you're seeing here is the plots of 3 different types of road section. On the blue plot, you have the approach to traffic signals. In the green plot, you have minor junctions or intersections, you might say. And in the red plot, you have dual carriageway roads, divided roads. And for each line, what we've done during our studies, we've plotted the number of crashes against the skid resistance value. And what we do is that we go across and we look at the curve and we're trying to pick out the points where crash rate accelerates or starts to pick up. And that's what we've done here. We've drawn these vertical lines and we think the crash rates are starting to pick up. For the approach to traffic signals, anything under about 0.5 scrim. For minor intersections, we're starting to get interested below about 0.45 scrim. And then the dual carriageways, our safest roads, you can see a slightly lower value, 0.35 approximately. And that's what we do. For various categories of road, we prepare these curves, and where the points where the curve starts to accelerate, we use these to create what we call our suite of investigatory levels, we'll sometimes call them. So we pick out these points where the crash risk increases dramatically, and then that will give us a good basis for then setting some levels for our sites, and then we can go off and plan our testing regime that we're going to do. So we divide our network into sections, typically 100-metre lengths or 50-metre lengths, depending on what's there on these individual road sections and what sort of demands are being placed on them. What you're seeing here is a tabular representation of a local suite of investigatory levels for the scrim machine. And this table was published in the Aus Guide in January 2005 and has originally come from the RTA that was in New South Wales, the IS now, and the Vic Roads organisation in Victoria. Let's pick out a few points on the table. As I mentioned, we break down the network into individual segments, and we assign a site category between 1 and 7 in this particular case, based on the site description. So if we've got a site where it's a traffic light controlled intersection, a pedestrian school crossing, a rail crossing and roundabout approaches, that will be a site category 1. and we'll assign, we'll look across and we'll look at our investigatory level for scrim at 50 kilometres an hour. And on primary roads, we'd assign an investigatory level of 0.55. On this particular example, there's a traffic criteria, which means we can set a slightly lower investigatory level for secondary roads with less than 2,500 vehicles per lane per day. And as you can see, we go down the different site categories. Category 3 is intersections, and you'll see a slightly lesser demand in investigatory level compared to our highest risk sites. And this is how it works. And you can see our manoeuvre-free areas on divided roads, our safest roads, our investigatory levels, our level of risk is a fair bit lower. Now, a number of suites of investigatory levels have been developed by road agencies, and they may have more or they may have less site categories. Here's another example. This is from the UK. This is the UK's motorway and trunk roads investigatory levels for scrim. And a couple of things I want to point out here for you. The first thing is that there are different category references. So it doesn't have to be 1 through to 7. There's no compulsion to do that. You can call them whatever you wish, and they've got some letter identifiers, and then on some, G1, G2, S1, S2 here as subcategories. But I wanted to pick up a few things here. The first one is that you have, in the dark shading, these are our typical default investigatory levels. This is what you would assign on if you didn't have any more information about the particular site. If you knew the site was fairly light on traffic, that particular category of road, and that you knew you had fairly low crash rate, you might be able to assign some of these lighter cells here of the slightly lower values for investigatory level. But you would need to have justification for it, and you would certainly need to record why you were doing that for a particular site. The other thing that I wish to point out as well is that you might have a range on some of your site categories. So for example here on G2, which is a gradient, there is 2 default investigatory levels there. So you have to make a decision on whether to apply 0.5 or 0.55. And the local strategy may well provide you with some written rules on that, or you need to just work it out from the crash rate. Maybe you need to apply the higher one. Certainly if you were going about it for the first time and you didn't know too much about the site, you would apply 0.55 for the first survey, and then we could adjust that. And we'll talk about how to adjust investigatory levels for sites a bit later. So that's a further example of a suite of investigatory levels. Just a reminder that we'll typically use 100-metre lengths, but on some of them, some of the higher stress sites and come out to curves and things, we need to apply them over 50 metres. The rules will also tell us typically what to do if we have a sort of a half and half situation where we've got what we call a residual length, where you need to consider, and often you will then decide to apply the highest investigatory level of the two to err side of safety. Here's one further suite of investigatory levels. Here's what our friends in New Zealand use on their national road network, again for scrim, and as you can see, pared down to 5 site categories, but a few subcategories in there, and they've done a lot of work on their curves to try and indicate whether curves are low, medium or high risk, as I'm indicating there, and that will set the default investigatory level accordingly. So as you can see, we typically set out our suite in a table or a listing of investigatory levels, and we'll come on to next how we apply those and use those. Okay, that's a lot of information. I just want to check again that people are travelling okay, and wonder if there's any questions.
Thank you, Paul. We did have a couple of questions. Thank you, John, for getting those through. Paul, could you just remind us again, with regards to investigations, what is the definition of regular?
The definition of, sorry?
Regular, sorry.
I didn't quite catch that. Regular.
Yes. What's the definition of regular?
In what context?
With regards to the investigations, what is the definition of regular? Or maybe we can ask John to provide a bit more detail on that one. We'll move on.
Sorry, which slide was that from?
Hasn't specified. It's from a little bit earlier on, but I might just get him to give us some more information on that one. Oh no, he's sent through another note. So how frequently should these investigations be carried out?
Okay, I'll cover a little bit later about the how often you would consider the investigatory levels and keeping them what we're calling dynamic in this particular webinar. But the site investigation per se will be triggered when you do your measurements. So you're setting up your investigatory levels or your suite of investigatory levels to then enable you to do your measurement for the first time on your network. And then I'll tell you in a second how we use these investigatory levels. So is that kind of answering the question?
All right, I think so. We'll just wait to hear back from John. Yep, John says all okay. So thanks for that, Paul. We might take another question from James this time. So James is asking, are standard scrim measurement procedures appropriate in long road tunnels that never get wet?
Yes, they are. We certainly wouldn't do anything. We have a standard protocol because we're trying to isolate the contribution of the road surface. A quite a specific question and one. So yeah, I can understand why you're asking that. But no, we wouldn't alter the test method at all. We still keep the water supply, and we measure in wet conditions, as people are probably aware, to give us our worst case scenario. So yeah, we certainly do that. We keep our standard test protocols.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. All right, we might take one more question before we move on. We have a question here from Hugh. Hugh's asking, is speed considered in investigation levels? So high-speed roads have lower investigation levels.
Well, yes, we kind of do, because we work out the crash rates for our various different types of roads. So our undivided carriageways tend to be our faster roads, carrying lots of traffic, but they tend to be our safest roads because basically we don't have a lot of crossing points, and where we do have merges, they're done at quite a shallow angle, and we don't have typically have traffic going across each other at 90 degrees, which gives us a lot of headaches normally. So we do consider that. I haven't seen speeds of investigatory levels where they're typically talking about speed limits. The reason for that is basically we're using our standard test protocol, as I say, so we keep that steady, and then we'll set our investigatory levels, working them out according to our crash profile, as we said.
All right, wonderful. Well then, thank you, Paul. We might move on with the presentation.
Okay, thanks for those questions. Perhaps I can ask you all a question, just to keep you moving, is, do you think it's an advantage or a disadvantage to set a large number of site categories? What do you think? Disadvantage or is it an advantage?
All right, so for our audience who haven't participated in one of these polls before, you'll see a blue pop-up box on your screen, and if you could just tick your respective answer, that will come through at our end. So we'll leave that open for a moment longer, and your answer choices there are disadvantage, advantage, or okay, as long as it can be managed. Paul, do you suspect there'll be a popular answer choice here?
Well, I'm kind of hoping that it's going to be the third one, I think. We'll see. I mean, I can understand people will select the previous two, but I'll explain why the third one may be the most appropriate in the second, if that's okay.
Very good. All right. Well, I'll share those results with our audience. Now, Paul, you sort of suspected correctly. So 64% of our audience did choose the third answer choice there. But we did have 18% say disadvantage and another 18% say advantage. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. No, I think that's pretty much as I would have expected. It can be a disadvantage because obviously it creates a lot of work assigning the categories, and also you've got to be prepared to manage it. The advantage of having lots of categories, of course, is you're going into a level of detail in assessing your network. So from that respect, you're really drilling down and getting to the crux of the matter. But I think it's one of these things. It's a bit of a compromise as to what you can manage and what gives you a reasonable result. So I think the answer really is we're looking at 3, but I can certainly understand why people might think it was 1 or 2, and there's no real right or wrong answer, I guess. So I just wanted to hold people's views on that one. So let's have a look at how we use our investigatory levels in practical terms. Now here's a picture of a grip tester. We've talked a bit about scrim investigatory levels, but don't forget, of course, we have a number of devices out there that measure what we call skid resistance, all slightly differently and give us a different effect. So I just put this in here to just flag up the fact that it's not just about having a suite of scrim investigatory levels. We can also establish them for the grip tester device and for the pendulum device or the fire friction, whatever we choose to measure our skid resistance in. So that's quite an important point to remember. What we do is that we will assign the pertinent investigatory level based on the table that we created, based on our suite of indicators. There may be some rules as to how we cut it up, as I mentioned, into 50 metre or 100 metre sections, etc. And typically this is a bit of a desk study. We apply our local knowledge, we look at aerial maps and strip maps and things that we might have. We can look at our geometric data. So we can be fairly confident that we're assigning what we think is a pretty good first investigatory level as a default. But in some cases where our network's quite large, or we're working from a central office and we're trying to establish our investigatory levels to assign to sections, we might decide to do a pre-testing survey. We might decide to drive the network and actually sort of annotate some maps and work out where we really want to start and finish our investigatory level sections. Or sometimes even we may employ a testing contractor and we ask them to assign the investigatory levels as they're going along on the fly during the testing. I'll call it on the fly, that's probably a bit demeaning, but basically it's driving along and actually putting down a best guess on the investigatory level as you are going along doing the testing. Now there's a few things to perhaps consider when you're doing this. Is if you're assigning investigatory levels, it makes good sense to have the same person doing it, if you possibly can. That gives you some consistency, some objectivity if you can, using data, and you want to try and remove the sort of randomness or subjectivity of it if you possibly can. If you're faced with the same situation, you would assign the same investigatory level. And what would we do if more than one site category applies when we're trying to do this? Well, in my opinion, it would be logical to certainly assign the higher of the 2 investigatory levels or the 3 investigatory levels, whatever it may be. And then, as we'll talk about in a moment, we can adjust locally after we've got a few couple of surveys under our belt, perhaps. So let's have a look at this in practice, how we might do this. Here's a schematic. It's from the UK, but it could conceivably be anywhere. And here's a road network, areas of the road, and it's color-coded according to where we want to start and finish our various segments of the same investigatory level. So for the yellow pieces of road, that's our road coming through here from left to right, right to left. That would be assigned a category A, and that we would need to decide between an investigatory level of 0.3 or 0.35. If we didn't know the site that well, we didn't have much background data, we'd almost certainly set 0.35, and then with an opportunity to take it down to 0.30 later if we had some good performance data from that particular road. And as you can track through the various categories here, and to point out that where we've got a curve and quite a tight one there, our investigatory level goes up, and we're talking here category R, 0.45 to 0.5, and as we mentioned, first time out we would set 0.5 that particular piece of road. Here's an example also of an intersection and how we would set the investigatory levels on an intersection. We're obviously interested on the approaches in both directions because that's where we're going to get to the demand for grip. And the shaded values, you can pick them out. Site category Q, that's coming up to an intersection, this particular locus grid of indicators. And we have to make our decision to assign between 0.45 and 0.55. And say, if we're looking at that site for the first time, we would obviously start off with 0.55. The white areas there in category C, there's slightly less demand. We've gone past the demand stage for the intersection, the critical areas of that intersection. So we have a lesser demand for scrim. So that's how we would work through and assign our investigatory levels in the office. And we would combine that perhaps with some visits to sites. This is an example of visual assessment. Here we are coming up to a railway crossing, and in this particular locus indicator, straight away we would assign that a site category 1, one of our highest stress sites. And if we applied the Aus roads values that are in there as an indication, we'd be looking at an investigatory level for scrim of 0.55, or if we had some prior information on the site or some background, maybe 0.5. Similar example, here we have a divided carriageway, very definitely a site category 5 in the Aus roads guide, and that would mean an investigatory level a lot lower, 0.35, because they are, as I say, some of our safest roads, and the demand for skid resistance is a lot less. So, in summary, what we do if we're selecting from a range of investigatory levels? Well, we follow any documented rules we have locally. It begs the question, even though we might have a range, are we allowed to use an investigatory level outside the range? Well, possibly so, but as I said, we need to have good justification for doing so. What might influence our decision might be a very low crash history, or indeed maybe even a very high crash history, in which case we would, what we call, ratchet up the investigatory level quite high. If you're not sure, is it better to set higher or lower investigatory level? Well, I've asked that question a couple of times, I think. Much better to set the highest one. And I can't stress enough that we need to document. If there's any confusion or uncertainty as to why we've been assigned a certain investigatory level for a road segment or road section, then we need to put down why we've done that, what is our rationale, what is our thinking behind the investigatory level that we've assigned. Okay, so that's how we use the thing in practice, setting them out before we do our survey. Just want to check that people are travelling okay. How are people going?
We've had a couple of questions come through, or some people are indicating they're okay, good, all good. Thank you to those of you. We might take a question before we move on. Is that okay, Paul?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. That's great.
All right, lovely. So we've had a question from Drew. So Drew's saying, main roads used to apply a treatment on intersection approaches that had potential skid resistance problems. However, research about the treatment was inconclusive and is no longer applied. Is there any research on types of retrospective treatments other than perhaps a reseal?
The answer to that is yes. We do have some before and after studies, particularly on things like high friction surfacings and thin surfacings. There's various studies around as to the results people are getting. As you probably realise, though, the information and the feedback that we get is only as good as the information we get back from the field. So, yeah, we're lacking that data in a lot of cases. But certainly there's been some localised studies done by the road agencies, not just at the state level, also at the local roads level as well, on various different surfacings. So I can pinpoint a few of those for Drew a bit later, and we'll get Drew's email address from the details, and I can get in touch with that as I can with anybody that's asked a question. So I'm happy to provide some more information a bit later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. And look, yes, if anyone does have any questions that pop into mind, perhaps after the presentation, or if we run out of time and can't address it today, please feel free to contact either Paul or myself, and we'll certainly be most happy to chat to you about that and discuss it further. Paul, one more question before we move on from Hiran. Thank you, Hiran. How would you incorporate skid resistance, SFC, to seal design?
How would you incorporate it?
Yeah.
The basic answer is that as an organisation you will have, or you should have, or you may well have an equation or a relationship which is based on the polished stone value of particular aggregates, or the polished aggregate friction value accordingly to the stone that you use in your spray seal design. So there should be something in your local documentation or your local standards which will give you a relationship between the skid resistance you're trying to achieve from the spray seal and what stone you use in that spray seal.
All right, lovely. Thank you, Paul. We can move on then.
All right, well, we've done a lot of background work. We've got our investigatory levels. We've created our table. We've assigned them to the sites. Let's think about how we do that now. We've got some test results. We send out the machines, and what we're basically doing is comparing our test results that we get to the assigned investigatory level for each road section. If the measurement is greater than that investigatory level, then things are going okay. We can typically take no action. There may be some other things which might come into the mix which may determine that we need to do something further, but typically that will prompt us to take no action. If the measured skid resistance is less than or equal to the assigned investigatory level, then in most strategies and most policies that will say to us we need to conduct a site investigation. What does that mean? Well, typically a site investigation will have both a desk study and a site component. And what we're trying to look at is the data that we've got, is it truly indicative of what's actually happening out there? And that's why we, not just the desk study bit, but also going out onto the site most typically. First question we look at, we go out onto the site, we take our local suite of investigatory levels and say, have we actually assigned the investigatory level correctly? Have they started and finished the particular segment for that investigatory level in the right place? And is it actually telling us something while we're on the site? We're observing the traffic, we might have the crash history with us, various things. So we're doing a lot more than just considering the data. In doing our site investigation, we will typically have one of three outcomes. The first one, as we mentioned, take no action. The second one is that, yeah, we're pretty certain we need some remedial action here. We've verified that there may well be an issue or a deficiency. We might decide that that could be some signage. We might decide that we're going to put this on the servicing program, or it could be a combination of things. It could be a package of measures that will help us to restore the skid resistance or to mitigate a drop in skid resistance in some way. But what we might also decide to do is review or adjust the investigatory level. We might have some local rules that will allow us to do that. Certain things might need to be in place, certain boxes need to be ticked before we can adjust it. We call that, or I typically call that, ratcheting the investigatory level up or down. It could be, for example, that the site history, the crash history is such that it's very, very low, and we can actually quite realistically and quite logically decide to adopt a lower investigatory level for the next survey. Of course, it's not just about one survey. What we're trying to do is to build up a bit of a history of our roads on our network and how they're performing. So it may be that, yes, we might be doing our scrim survey or skid survey only every 3 years, but we're trying to continue to monitor our local skid resistance strategies. So we keep our sites and we get them tested every year, every 3 years, depending on what your strategy might be. Okay, another question for you. Our local suite of investigatory levels and our assigned investigatory levels of the site, do you think that they should stay constant, or do you think that we should keep them dynamic? What do you think?
Alrighty, I've opened that poll, and if everyone could just tick their answer and get those through to us, we'll discuss them once all the results are in. So far, everyone who's voted has said no. Paul, is that what you were expecting to see?
Very much so. That's encouraging and
fantastic. Well, I might close that off because the majority of our audience has voted now, so I'll share those results with everyone. And 95% of our audience said no. So very promising, Paul.
Okay, well, that's great, and it's probably my most colourful slide. We do need to keep the investigatory levels dynamic. In terms of individual sites and our assigned investigatory levels, as I touched upon a little bit earlier, perhaps review those every 2 or 3 years. People will do that routinely, but there may be something else that will prompt a review in the interim. So certainly a minimum of every 2 or 3 years. Do it consistently, do it in a disciplined way. Make sure that you're applying the rules of the game for your local strategy, and we also do that to reflect the evolution of the network. Things are going to change on the network. Demands, there may be a new side road put in, there may be something that appears, or a road use that appears, or an industrial use, or a new shopping facility on the side of the road which introduces an intersection, and all of a sudden we need to reflect that, the fact we've got an intersection on what was previously a mid-block road. Use the site geometry data as much as we possibly can. It's really helpful if we've got the measured radius of the curve rather than just guessing whether it's above 250 metres radius, say, or below. Using that hard data to assign investigatory levels, it's very, very useful, and it's very dependable if we get into any problems later. We want to try and remove that over-reliance on on-the-fly assignments. So if we can give our investigatory levels to sites to our testing contractor, that's much better than them having to go along and assign an investigatory level as they're going. In terms of our wider strategy, our local suite of investigatory levels, our table, if you like, with all our site categories on there, the recommendation is probably to review that at least every 5 years. And the reason for doing that, again, is just making sure that we can actually resource our policy, making sure that it's achievable, and that we can demonstrate that we're achieving it. Nothing worse than setting that bar way too high for ourselves. We need to make sure also that the policy and strategy is giving us some positive outcomes. So we need to occasionally bite the bullet and look at that local suite of investigatory levels, perhaps go back and do our crash risk curves again, and work out whether we need to make any changes, any amendments to our investigatory levels. As I showed you, our colleagues in New Zealand are doing a lot more now in terms of curves, and that was prompted by a review of the network and what's happening, but also a need that they, every now and again, would review their local suite of skid resistance investigatory levels. So all part of a continual improvement process. But of course, can't stress enough again about record keeping. If you do change the investigatory levels and the strategy, you obviously need to record why and the sort of work that you've done to make those changes to justify it and have that available on the file. One of the things historically that we've done is that we've adopted suites of investigatory levels from the UK. The UK has had a long track record in measuring skid resistance. And that's fine. It's given us something that we can use. But we need to remember, of course, that if we do that, or if we adopt somebody else's suite of investigatory levels, not just from the UK, but if we're, for example, in New South Wales and we adopt the investigatory levels used in Tasmania, for example, actually what we're doing is we're actually letting somebody else set our organisation's risk profile. And that's quite a thing to remember. It will do a job for us, yeah. It's, you know, we can say it's the ready-made option, it's an easy option, there's a track record there, but also don't forget sometimes the suite of investigatory levels could also have been applied, for example, in the UK, to a motorway and trunk road network. And we might be trying to apply it to a local road network and setting the bar way too high from us accordingly. So the question I'm saying is, if you have a suite of investigatory levels these days in your road agency, I challenge you to work out whether they are the legacy of somebody else's system, whether you have any background, local analysis that's led to them to being developed. And ask yourself the question, are they right for you? Are they right for Australia, for example? There is some specific Aus guidance available on how to develop a bit of investigatory levels from first principles using the equalisation of crash risk as well. So you're not alone, there is a bit of help out there for you to go through this process if you were looking to do so. Okay, we're closing in on the end of the webinar, and we've had a look at a very specific part of our skip resistance strategy. Setting the investigatory levels. It is a specific part of it, and it's certainly a very, very important part of it. We're setting that level of risk that we're prepared to accept as a road agency. And that is a really, really important point to remember. If we assign somebody else's investigatory levels, we need to understand the consequences or the implications of doing this. I'm not suggesting for a second it's the wrong thing to do, but you need to understand that in time we need to ask questions and we need to challenge our investigatory levels and keep them dynamic and keep them real and keep them according to the conditions on our road network.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your attendance today. Just to summarise, there are some Aus guides out there. Have a look at the Aus website, or if you want some references to the Aus guides, please drop me an email and I'll do so very happily. We are planning to run a workshop on some of the issues raised today at the next ARB conference in October. So please keep your eyes on the things that are about the conference. Keep your ear to the ground, as they say, to see whether we will be, in fact, having that workshop on skip resistance issues, which will include local investigatory levels. So I assume there may be some final questions, but I'll put up a final slide with my contact details on there. If you have any other questions, put them through email. I will provide an answer to some of the questions that have been answered today. I'll get hold of the questions, the transcript of those, and I'll provide some additional responses if I need to do so. So thank you very much for participation today, and it's hopefully been very useful for you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm sure it was very, very useful. I know I learned a few things and very much enjoyed working with you on yet another webinar project. We did have a question come through from Laszlo, so I'll send that through to you, Paul. He's asking, what is the expected accuracy of the measured SFC test results?
Okay, I'll provide some separate information on that. The basic answer is the repeatability and reducibility of the test are pretty good. I'll send some information on that, and we'll have some sort of R-square values and various things like that for the scrim test. So that would be the best way to answer that one, I think, Angela.
No worries at all. Well, I might leave it open for another moment for a few more questions to come through, but I'll just remind everyone that we have recorded today's session and it will be available to all of you once again, perhaps today or tomorrow. If you keep an eye on your emails, I'll get that through to you. Paul, thank you very much for your time, and I can't wait to work on the next webinar project with you. And for our audience today, once the webinar closes down, you'll see a survey pop up on your screen. It's a really great opportunity to let us know what you thought of today's webinar, and if there's any way that we can improve for future, we'd love to hear from you. All right, Paul, thanks again for today, and look forward to the next webinar. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.